Good afternoon and welcome. The session today is on state legitimacy, service delivery, and conditions of violence. We have a wonderful panel. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a moment. We'll start with a short introduction to the themes. Then we're going to divide the session broadly into 3 blocks. The first will focus with 2 presentations on service delivery and legitimacy. Is there a relationship? Does service delivery matter? And does it matter whether governments provide services directly or NGOs do? And then we'll have a short Q&A after that. The second block will be on the relationship of service delivery in conditions of violence and the very practical question of how to deliver services in violent settings. And then we'll have a general discussion on these themes. So that's the order today. I'll start with introductions. To my right, Bob Sam, Country Director for Afghanistan, but please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Sam. I'm the World Bank's Country Director resident in Kabul, Afghanistan.
Good afternoon. I'm Ashley Jackson, Research Associate with the Overseas Development Institute.
Adam Payne, been working with SLIC Afghanistan over the last 4 years.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Simon O'Mealy, Senior Governance Specialist with the World Bank, based in India.
I'm Alina Rocha Menocar, a Senior Research Fellow at the Developmental Leadership Program at the University of Birmingham.
I'm Rachel Slater from the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium.
I'm Richard Hogg. I'm the program leader in Afghanistan for the World Bank.
And finally, I'm Claire Lockhart, Director of the Institute for State Effectiveness, and I'm based here in DC. I'm going to start by asking Bob just to say a few words about the themes of today's sessions, and then we'll turn to our first presenter for the presentation.
Thank you, Claire. The topic for this afternoon is actually one that is often discussed, but for which there seems to be not many conclusions, and the discussions go on. And the discussions you get into is about the role of service delivery in state legitimacy reinforcing service delivery, or service delivery reinforcing that, the role of service delivery in reducing violence, the impact of violence on service delivery. So and there in Kabul, we often get into these circular discussions, and being able to take a step out of those often becomes very difficult. And that's what I think this afternoon's series of presentations and your discussion and questions and comments from you is going to be very useful. In a place like Afghanistan, or very early on, and I'm sorry, those of you who are waiting in the back, there are several seats up here and over here at the table. So please come on in and fill in at the table. And we have plenty of seats on both sides as well. In Afghanistan, as one example, very early on in 2002, the service delivery elements were among the first to be financed, the first to be brought forward by the government. Basic health care, primary education, the National Solidarity Program, which reached out to 30,000 communities, rural roads, and then going on to some of the other areas with provision of energy and other services. And so there's a long history, particularly in Afghanistan, and we'll hear about some of that today, but we'll also hear experiences from other countries. And I would encourage all of you to be thinking about, as I mentioned, the circular discussions that we find ourselves into. I don't expect that we'll finally resolve it today, but I do expect that we'll have some sufficient questions posed to us, some experiences identified that will at least enable all of us to draw some ideas, some conclusions, and some ways forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and I think it's an excellent introduction. The only thing I would add is to have in mind also, I don't think we have the G7 Plus formally represented with us here, but we know that at the heart of the G7 Plus work and the New Deal and the INCAF's work was the centrality of the social compact between a government and citizen based on the premise of service delivery. And as that process is reviewing its results, are there different types of questions that we need to be asking? With that, Rachel is going to speak to us on service delivery and legitimacy findings from a 5-country panel survey in DRC, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Uganda.
I'm going to start talking quite loud while they figure this out.
Okay.
We've got it now.
The very threat got us working.
Right. Yesterday, if some of you were in the session looking at whether aid or donors can build institutions, a colleague of mine, Hamish, talked about something that we talk about often in our project, about the baby in the bathwater. And it struck me that one way of taking you through the findings of the work that we've been doing is to tell you about 3 hashtags from a survey that we've been doing in 5/6 conflict-affected countries. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk you through background of the SLRC, the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, so you know the context in which we're doing the work that we're doing. I'm going to briefly raise and highlight this received wisdom that we find in all of the countries where we work, that delivering services in conflict-affected situations will contribute to state building, in particular to state legitimacy. And then I'm going to challenge some of that received wisdom by presenting findings from the survey that we've done and talk through what some of the implications are. So first of all, the SLRC. We're a research consortium, and we're tasked with exploring an enormous number of things. So livelihoods and basic services, health, education and water and sanitation, and social protection in conflict-affected situations. We're doing that in 8 core countries, 4 in South Asia approximately, and 4 in Africa. We work with 7 core partners and a whole host of affiliates across those countries. And we're a big, big program, 6 years, currently in our final year, £8 million from DFID, more than €1 million from Irish Aid, and a further $1 million from the EU. So we're really big, but we're covering a whole heap of ground. And one of the particularly important things that we're focusing on is this received wisdom. And this is just one example of what I'm told in all of the countries where we work every time I go anywhere. And this is a government official in Kabul last year. How, if it's NGOs and not the government delivering services, will we build the state? We hear it all the time. We hear something even broader than that we have to deliver services in order to build that compact between citizens and the state. We have to deliver services in order to enhance social cohesion. We hear this everywhere we go. We hear it from NGOs, we hear it from people in government, we hear it from donors an awful lot too. And what we're going to do is try and challenge some of that. We do that particularly through the first research question here. Does support to services, social protection and livelihoods equal state building, particularly state legitimacy? And in the early work that we did in the SLRC, we did some massive lit review and evidence review work and found that despite the frequency with which we hear these kinds of statements, there's actually very, very little good empirical evidence to prove any of it. So we're spending an enormous amount of money, maybe 48 billion in 2009, at least we think 30 billion in the last couple of years, delivering services with the specified objective of building the state. We also focus on 2 other questions, one about building state capacity and one about livelihoods, but I'm going to focus just on the first of these today. So how are we trying to understand this? Well, we're doing something that we think is pretty, well, we know is unique. We're doing a panel survey. We're doing that because we found that there's very little quantitative evidence that tries to understand state building over time. We're doing it in 5 countries, plus South Sudan, and in each place working in 2 or 3 districts. Some places where there are high levels of service delivery, some places with very limited service delivery. And we're doing it through a longitudinal panel. Now, people describe different things when they talk about longitudinal panels, but just to be clear, we are not going back to the same villages and resampling. We're not even just going back to the same households. We're going back to the same individual over periods of 3 years and asking them questions about their perceptions, in particular, of government actors. And, what does that enable us to do? It enables us to get beyond averages of how people feel about government and instead track when their access to services changes, what then happens to their perceptions of different government actors. And we're using a bunch of proxies about people's views of governments as our way of getting towards what it means for the state to be legitimate. And with quant work, that's about as far as you can go in terms of understanding state legitimacy, is using these proxies. We're in 5 countries, and we're talking about a big sample, more than 9,000 people that in the second round we've gone back and tried to talk to. And we found about over 8,000 of them in the second round and have been able to stay representative at particular levels. So, 3 hashtags that I think encompass the key findings that I want us to reflect on today. First of all, hashtag tail wagging the dog. That means that instead of the dog wagging its tail is wagging the dog. So the wrong thing is in control of a situation or is driving a situation. Second, the baby in the bathwater, that when the bathwater has got dirty, when we throw it out, we've also thrown out the baby with it. Not a great idea. And then finally, we sometimes call this hashtag Bananarama because it's the first record that I ever bought when I was young. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. So I'm going to talk you through them. So first of all, the big finding, service delivery and state legitimacy. Does this received wisdom hold true? We found some interesting things across the 5 countries. First of all, that people's reported satisfaction with the services they received were surprisingly high. But we think that tells us more about people's expectations of service delivery than it does about real levels of satisfaction. So if you haven't received services ever, you don't expect to get them. So when you get something small, you're more likely to be satisfied. We also found a critical distinction in terms of people's perceptions between their views of local government actors and of national or high-level government actors. In particular, that people were more critical of national actors than they were of local ones. But, and here's the crux of it, overall, across our 5 countries, across the numerous different sectors that we worked in, we can find no evidence of either a linear or a consistent relationship between people's experiences of services and their views of the government. That doesn't mean there is no relationship between services and state legitimacy. That's something that people often say after hearing us talk. That's not the case. There's no evidence of any linear relationship. Okay, so that leads us to 2 things. Number 1 is the tail wagging the dog. Now, a number of times I've talked to DFID governance advisors about some of these findings, and quite often have ended up with them furiously shaking their heads at me when I've said this, that state building isn't and shouldn't be our primary objective when we're delivering services. We're delivering services to meet people's basic needs and improve their well-being, and that should always be our primary goal. But we have a concern that what's happening now is that we've got so obsessed with state building and state legitimacy that that is driving the way that we deliver services. And that leads us to another fear, that if we show that we're not contributing towards state building, are we going to throw the baby out with the bathwater? If we've allowed the state building objective to be bigger than delivering services to meet basic needs, are we going to stop funding delivery of services in conflict-affected situations because it's not helping us build the state? And we're quite concerned that people will make these big leaps and do things that are particularly damaging for people in conflict-affected countries. So if there's no linear relationship, the next big question is, does who delivers services matter? for the relationship between service delivery and people's perceptions. And the first point here is that in many of the countries where we work, the state is barely present. So here's DRC, South Kivu, and government delivering, respondents reporting that for less than 3.6% of them, they get water services from government. They're coming from a massive range of other sources. And we don't think this is because non-state actors are crowding out the government. We think it's because the government has never been there and is not going to be there in the long term. NGOs are not chasing government away. The second thing is that who delivers does matter for people's satisfaction with services. So here's an example from Nepal, where people receiving health clinic services from a private provider were more satisfied than those receiving it from government. But that only takes us so far. And the key finding is that there are no statistically significant relationships between the provider of the service and people's perceptions of government actors. We've no evidence that if an NGO delivers a service, or a faith-based organisation, or a donor, that has a negative effect on how people feel about the government. We've done this a number of times. We've run it for whether it's local or national government actors. We've run it for all of the different services that we look at. We've run it for all of the different kinds of proxies that we've got for measuring people's attitudes towards government. And we can't find anything linear or consistent across all of those sectors and across the countries. And just a brief example, if you're interested in the numbers, an extraction from our regression findings on what influences whether people never or almost never think that local government decisions reflect their priorities. And what you find here is in the red circle, for those of you who can't follow this very easily, only one statistically significant relationship in the whole regression across all of the countries that we looked at. And then in the black circle, just to point this out, even though it's not statistically significant, things working in different ways. Sometimes people are more likely to say that the government doesn't reflect their priorities if they're receiving services from government. Sometimes they're less likely. So no pattern, no clear pattern in either direction. So what does matter then for services and state legitimacy? Well, here comes the third hashtag. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. So how you deliver services is as important as anything else that we can find for leading or contributing to state legitimacy. Here's Nepal. Government decisions reflect my priorities. Vast majority of people, for both local and central governments, saying that that happens never or almost never. So pretty negative perceptions of government from all the proxies that we have. The one thing that we do find influences people's perceptions are things like this. Participating in a community meeting about services. Here's the data from Sri Lanka. Lots of people participating across all the sectors that we looked at. And this influences it too. Whether we've got a grievance mechanism and people know how to use it and are using it, we find has a really big impact on the way that people feel about government. So, the big story, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. Having access to grievance mechanisms, having participatory processes around services is what counts. And what people often say at this point is, well, these meetings in Sri Lanka are not really participation, are they? You're right about that. They're right at the bottom, on the bottom rung of this ladder of participation. But that counts. Even just sharing a bit of information with people about services makes a massive difference to their perceptions. So, second to last slide. This leads us to raise a big challenge to this received wisdom on state building and on post-conflict recovery. We found no evidence of performance legitimacy from our survey, no evidence that delivering something results in improved perceptions of government. And what we think we have found, because of it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it, is that it's relational and interactions between service providers and service receivers that really matter, not this simple transactional view. It's also become clear to us that you don't necessarily need to have state actors delivering services in order to achieve legitimacy. People somehow seem to accept or acknowledge the space that the government allows for other people to deliver services as a positive act on the part of government. We've also picked up on the idea that transitions from conflict to post-conflict are not linear. We've worked in places that are supposedly post-conflict and there's stacks of fighting still going on. We've worked in places that are supposedly in conflict, but actually the areas that we're in are relatively peaceful. And there are implications there for the idea that post-conflict NGOs and non-state providers are crowding out the state. We simply can't find evidence to show that that's true. So overall, our technical, our transactional approaches to state building and supporting livelihoods as well need a big rethink. For us, history matters, the legacies of conflict matter, and informal or historical institutions matter. So finally, a tiny bit of breaking news from the second round. The first thing is that we did it. Everyone told us when we started trying to do a longitudinal panel and find these people 3 years later that we were crazy. We've blogged a lot about the "are we crazy" statements we heard from people. We did it. We added 20% to our sample in the first round in order to stay representative in the second round, and we've done it. We found more than 8,000 people 3 years later in places like Eastern Congo, in northern Uganda, and so on. And we are finding the changes that we need for panel analysis. We're finding people's access to services has changed. We're finding changing well-being and changing perceptions. So watch this space, because we think we've got a really great contribution to make over the next 6 months or so to helping put to bed some of the problems with this received wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Second presentation, and then we'll go to a Q&A on this block, is on service delivery and local government legitimacy in Jordan and Lebanon. And Alina is going to present. I believe it's your co-author's not here, but you're presenting on the behalf of both of you.
Tim Williams' better looking half, if you haven't been able to tell. No, but I am presenting on behalf. Just briefly as a caveat, I want to say that Rachel and I made a pact last night that we were not going to have PowerPoint. And Rachel betrayed me, but that's okay. I'm going old school. She has much more visual stuff to share than I do, so I'm going to go old school and hope that you all listen to what I'm saying. And Tim Williams is not here, but in reality, the work that I will be presenting here is something that he helped commission at the FID, but that was done by a team of researchers both at the University of Birmingham, the Developmental Leadership Program, and the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. So anyway. Just briefly, from what Rachel was saying, there is this received wisdom within the international development community that service delivery is an integral part of helping to foster legitimacy and social stability, especially in conflict-afflicted states. But as we just have heard from her, if there is a relationship, it is far from linear, and many different factors come into play when mediating this relationship, things like norms, expectations, relationships. And I would also say that power and politics are at the very heart of this. So what I want to spend the next 15 minutes or so on is telling you a little bit about this project called Service Delivery and Social Stability in Lebanon and Jordan that DLP is working on with DFID and other partners on the ground in Lebanon, again, the American University of Beirut, and in Jordan, a group of researchers that belong to an outfit called Leading Point. And in essence, we have two dimensions to the research. One is very much focused on evidence base and building the evidence base, really to further test assumptions about whether or not service delivery and legitimacy and social stability are linked, and whether or not this is a positive, a negative, or a neutral relationship. So we want to help build the evidence base on that. And the other one is very much linked to operational and programmatic concerns. There has been a lot of talk over the past 10 years or so about the need of donors to think in a more politically savvy way, to act more strategically, and to work in more adaptable and flexible manners. And we want to see how this pans out in actual practice. And this project provides an opportunity to really have an iterative process of learning and adaptation while programs are ongoing. So just to give you a brief description of this project, which is much smaller than what SLRC is doing, but in essence, we are following or accompanying or working very closely with two DFID-assisted programs in the MENA region. and the idea is that this will be done over the course of 2+ years. The first one is the Lebanese Host Communities Program, which obviously is in Lebanon, and the other is the Jordan Emergency Services and Social Resilience Project, which is in Jordan. And these programs are set up very differently by design. The LHSP, which is the Lebanon one, is done in partnership with the Ministry of Social Affairs there, which has been designated by the government of Lebanon as the entity that needs to coordinate the response to the Syrian refugee crisis, and the UNDP. Whereas in Jordan, the program is a partnership between the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and the World Bank. However, both of these programs share an underlying theory of change, which very much mirrors what Rachel has been talking about, which is essentially that supporting the provision of basic services through participatory mechanisms at the municipal level, especially municipalities that have been put under a lot of stress because of the inflow of refugees, will be very important in maintaining local social stability and in fostering legitimacy of state authorities. And I want to emphasize here that these two programs are explicitly focused on the host communities and not on the refugee populations. Another ambition of the project as it evolves is to be able to learn a little bit about whether and how the two programs work differently because of the different contexts in which they operate, but also because of their different setups, and whether or not we can learn from that as we move forward. The research approach is very much qualitatively based on cyclical visits to different municipalities in both Jordan and Lebanon, and also is complemented by other research, more quantitative, I would say, in nature, that the programs themselves are requesting from other organizations, namely Actis in the case of Lebanon, who is doing very interactive, innovative methodology based on SenseMaker, and more survey work being done by REACH in Jordan. And as I was saying, these visits are cyclical, and the idea is that we go back to the countries and to the municipalities every 9 months or so to see how things have evolved, if anything has changed, and pointedly also to ask about how the programs are functioning and whether or not any of the lessons that emerge have been adapted for flexibility and for reasons to respond to the context. So we have started with the first cycle of fieldwork only in Lebanon, so I'm not in a position to say anything about Jordan. So I just want to share with you some of the key findings that have emerged from the Lebanese context, and then hopefully we will have many more iterations both in Lebanon and Jordan. And I don't have time really to go through the methodology, but if there are questions about that, I'll be happy to address those. But just briefly, in Lebanon, again in partnership with our AUB colleagues there, we went to 3 municipalities and did also a bunch of extensive interviews in Beirut. And I just wanted to share with you some of the key takeaway messages that come both from the research side of the question that we have and also from the programmatic or policy application side. So in terms of the research side, and I think a lot of what I have to say here will echo very nicely what Rachel has discussed in terms of the SLRC. There are many different mechanisms for delivery, some of them more formal and led by the state local authorities, but many more perhaps in the Lebanese case are informal networks. In principle, all services are available to all community members, but of course there's inequality of access due to a lot of different factors, and I would say here again politics plays a key role. There are a lot of clientelistic networks, so if you're plugged into the clientelistic network, you probably have better access to services. If you're not, and you don't know how to play the system, you're probably going to receive less services. However, we can see from the work that we have done there and also drawing on the SenseMaker stories that Actis has been working on, that people feel or have been feeling more over time that they can approach the municipalities with their problems. And again, here it's a very personal relationship with individual politicians and officials. Syrians were cited as putting pressure on resources to some extent, but also there was a deep acknowledgement among all of the people that we spoke with that there was a real problem with service delivery beforehand, before the crisis in Syria took place. There were mentions that improvements in services can in fact help to reduce tensions, and some of the informants we spoke with noted that improvements and increased attention actually came as a result of the Syrian refugee crisis. In general, in the Lebanese context, because there's so much interaction that goes back with Syria over time, there was a feeling also that if tensions were present, they tended to be more personal than group-based, and also they tended to be spoken of rather than acted upon. So there were relatively few incidents of violence that had taken place in the municipalities within the last year or so, although that had not been the case before. Now, in terms of the awareness and expectations of services, which is again something that Rachel has talked about, in the Lebanese context, within the people that we spoke with, there seems to be a pretty high level of awareness about the kinds of programs that donors are providing, and these tend to be quite visibly labeled. So there's this awareness raising intention, and in the communities it has become clear who's providing what. And in a sense, the community people feel that donor projects do tend to address needs, although it is not always clear that these are the priorities, and I will get into that point a bit later on. There are also some indications that the municipalities and the municipal authorities are really beginning to re-envision their role to move beyond being the mere providers of services, in fact, big infrastructure projects or service delivery, towards more of playing a more important role in resolving social tensions and promoting social stability within the municipality. And this is something that has been attributed to the generation of invited spaces of collaboration and sharing, sort of echoing a little bit what Rachel was saying. There is also awareness that municipal capacity is often limited, but nonetheless, people's expectations of what the municipality should be delivering are increasing, and especially they were being approached very much and very often about issues related to employment and job creation, which is well beyond the remit of the municipalities. So there's a issue here of whether or not too much is being expected of municipalities and how one builds the capacity of the municipality to be able to respond, or how to deal with these problems that are much wider. In terms of increased trust and legitimacy, it became striking that in fact it seems to be the case that municipal governments or authorities are getting increased trust from the population. But this sort of growth of trust in the municipalities is not really accruing upwards to the central government. And here the impression is that, you know, the central government has never really worked, and that both the municipal governments, even if they're not capable, and donors are better able to provide services and see for the municipal needs. So that's in terms of the findings from the research side. Now I will briefly touch upon findings in terms of the way that the LHSP as a program that the FID is supporting works, and whether or not we can see elements in this of a politically savvy approach that is also flexible and adaptable. And I would say as a first point of order that the LHSP does in fact reflect critical learning and adaptation on how donors need to engage in relation to the Syrian crisis, given the tensions and even harm that was caused by the original donor approach, which was very much focused on the refugees themselves and their needs, and not sufficiently or at all on what the host populations needed. The LHSP is also unique and innovative in many different ways. One of the key innovations that was totally novel in the Lebanese context is a methodology called Maps of Risks and Resources, which is intended to provide room for a participatory decision-making process that goes really beyond the usual suspects at the municipal level and the authorities there. The idea here is really to provide a space of interaction within different stakeholders at the community level, but also linking that up to the central level. And another innovation was the development of clear, specific, and transparent criteria to identify the municipalities that would be benefiting from this project, from the program rather. And this is usually based on the ratio of refugees to local host community population, and also to poverty levels. And again, this type of allocation had never been done before. Usually has been much more informal and based on clearly subjective criteria. And just briefly to say that from all of the people we spoke to on the ground, everyone was really impressed and committed with, complementary with the kind of role that DFID played, not really or exclusively in terms of the financial contribution to the program, but especially in terms of the kind of commitment in terms of knowledge and helping to give shape to the LHSP and engaging in constant dialogue and pushing the boundaries of what the program should look like. So that the sort of relational aspect of this was quite important. The way that the LHSP was set up itself and the kinds of choices that DFID made to engage in the Lebanese context really do reflect a politically savvy approach. As I said, in Jordan it looks very different. It's done through the World Bank. But here there was the intuition that it was really important to focus at the municipal level and to engage directly with the Ministry of Social Affairs, which had not been the main partner that donors had traditionally worked with. And in fact, DFID was the first one that made a very big push to work with MOSA. The Ministry of Municipal Affairs rather than the Ministry of Interior or others like that. And so it was really a strategic choice that the FID made to remain engaged at the municipal level rather than at higher levels of government organization. And the program itself also has displayed, in terms of, for example, the way that the UNDP staff work, there are some elements of which show that there has been an appetite to take some risks. But here what's telling is that the risks have been taken when funding is much more limited and smaller in scale, because then that gives them a bit of more flexibility to take those risks. Individuals and relationships have been absolutely instrumental in making this program work as well as it has. And from our conversations, it became clear that the engagement between the different stakeholders just to give shape to this program that was quite innovative in the Lebanese context really brought people together very nicely. But it leaves the question open of whether and how these relationships can become institutionalized beyond individuals. And now we have an interesting experiment live, if you will, because one of the key architects of this program from the DFID side has now moved on, and this is a period of transition, so it will be interesting to see what happens. Just briefly to move on to a few challenges that have come up. Okay. There's one issue of scale, which is that these programs, these projects that the programs are supporting are quite micro and very much focused on the municipal level. The idea was that they were going to be complemented by higher programs and more additive programs of support happening at the union level and beyond. But because of the way that the Lebanese government functions, this has not come to fruition. In fact, there's a huge World Bank trust fund there that cannot spend any money. So this is something that has to be addressed. And then very briefly, just perhaps to finish, we found a whole lot of potential unintended consequences that have to be further looked into. And perhaps the one that I will mention before closing is that there has been perceptions between different municipalities that they have not benefited from this program. This is pointedly the case of Hezbollah-controlled municipalities for political reasons, but also neighboring municipalities who see what's happening here and not there. And this is actually interesting because this is where you see how objective criteria are one thing and how people perceive them are completely different. So you may have this formula that is transparent and has been agreed upon and signed upon by different actors at different levels, but in reality, people perceive that others are getting things that they're not, and this can generate some tensions that have to be followed through. So the intention of this project that we're doing with the LP and the American University of Beirut is to actually follow up on these kinds of things that we find over time in these cyclical visits, so that then we have cumulative knowledge building upwards, and we can see whether and how these tensions pan out, these challenges pan out, and how the programs can respond on the ground. And hopefully, as Rachel was saying for SLRC, you can watch this space as we continue to grow and have more research to share. Thanks.
Thank you to both of you. We now have 15 minutes for Q&A. And I might turn first to our panelists for any quick comments and initial thoughts, and then open it up to the room for questions.
I think both of these presentations laid out what I mentioned in my opening remarks, is that these are the kinds of questions that people struggle with. People love to talk about it, but often are talking about it without reference to data. And I find it very difficult to separate this from being an emotional issue to being a data-driven issue. Now, I think on this topic, it's probably not possible to entirely move it to being a data-driven decision-making process, because and you started, Alina, getting to your last point about the objectivity in the selection of the communities maybe not necessarily working. As soon as we get into questions about service delivery in a fragile state, objectivity and data is not the primary driver of decisions, we have to be honest about. It's very much emotional, it's very much political, it's very much all these others. So one of the things that I think as this work continues, and something that we in the World Bank in Afghanistan and our development partners and the government there, I think, struggle with, is how to get the right balance between knowing what maybe the research and the data tells us, but also knowing what happens when you listen to people, and the emotional, the political, the ethnic, I mean, the list goes on and on. How do you balance those in this particular area of service delivery? Because what we're talking about here is educating girls. We're talking about, women who die from childbirth. We're talking about very hard-hitting human issues on service delivery that makes the decisions and the discussions even that much more difficult. So not sure if that adds to or helps with any of the questions or confusion, but for the practitioners in the field and to the governments with whom we work and the people, I think these are exactly the kind of challenges that they face on an issue like this. So I think should we open it up for questions then?
I think so, and I'll save mine for the end. I'm longing to ask Alina if to put the issue of the movement in Lebanon to pick up the trash, whether your research was before or after that, and whether that, once that became a media phenomenon, made that any difference. But I'll save that till the end. Let's open it up to the room. Please introduce yourself with your name and your organizational affiliation if you have one. Comments are welcome, also questions, and we'll just take them one by one unless there's a huge sea of hands.
Okay. My name is Usman Jah. I'm from the World Bank. The research findings seem to point to the lack of a linear relationship between service delivery and state legitimacy. Should we take that to mean that there is no contribution at all, or that the contribution is not linear? Because to my mind, state legitimacy is the sum total of a host of influences, and I'm wondering if the other possible influences that might have impacted state legitimacy positively or not were controlled for in this research. And another question also is, has this research been undertaken in non-fragile situations or countries, such that, there might be instructive lessons from other countries other than Pakistan, that has been afflicted by fragility? We might want to compare views of service delivery vis-a-vis state legitimacy in non-fragile contexts to see if there might be lessons inherent in the findings. Another last question is, how did we, what interpretation have we given to state legitimacy? What are the questions that spoke to state legitimacy in the research findings? This might be important. Thank you.
Thank you. Alina, Rachel, would you like to respond?
Thanks very much for the questions. Some of them are precisely the questions that we have asked ourselves a lot over the last few years. I think the first thing to say is that we have not said that service delivery has no consistent or linear relationship with state legitimacy. We can't say that. We can say it has no linear or consistent relationship with people's perceptions of government actors. And we recognise that those, that somebody's perception of a government actor is a proxy, and a simple proxy for state legitimacy, but it doesn't tell us everything. But what we will be able to do when we have the second round of the panel is to start looking at changes in direction and what drives them. So we'll be able to identify patterns or different lines and changes that we can't get from a snapshot from the first round. So it will take us somewhere, but we're never going to get to this equals state legitimacy. It's not feasible in quant work. We can get some of the way. How have we controlled for other factors? If you look at, I can't remember what the R-squared values were on the table that I showed you, but most of our R-squared values are below 0.2. So that means, for people who don't do this kind of work, that means that our model is explaining 20% of what is going on. So it is not, there are 80% of what's happening is not explained by the variables in our model. Now, some people think that's a real weakness, especially people who work on qualitative work, but I'd also dispute the idea that a qualitative piece of work helps you understand more than 20% of what's going on either, realistically. What we're going to be able to do when we have the second round is look at some of the big changes, the big other factors that may be influencing what's going on. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, looking at changes of government in the 3 different districts where we work and how that may be influencing. So we're able to account for some of those big macro changes in ways that we're not able to do when there's a snapshot. It's part of why doing the panel is so useful. We've looked at lessons from other countries, from non-fragile places. We've been looking at tracking the data from the Paris 21 initiative, particularly the work on happiness and people's perceptions of their own lives. It doesn't take us especially far because we have a specific focus on a specific part of the legitimacy, the range of ways that we can look at legitimacy. So there are lots of different definitions or components that contribute to legitimacy. We're looking at output or performance legitimacy, that specific question of when you deliver something to people, do you get legitimacy in return? But there are lots of other things. There's legitimacy around sovereignty, around territorial power, around processes, so do you have a democratic system, and so on. We can't measure those within the survey, except for some stuff on process legitimacy about grievance mechanisms and so on. But what we think we are able to do is unlock what we really know about a particular part of the legitimacy puzzle. And that's as far as we can take it. So we think SLRC is doing something really valuable in terms of unpicking legitimacy and figuring out one component of it, but it is absolutely dependent on mixed methods and looking at other parts of the puzzle in order to try and come up with the full answer.
Is it? Okay. I tried to make a pact with Richard that I could speak for 20 minutes, but that came down very quickly. But part of the stuff that I wanted to outline at the beginning is precisely this, that legitimacy is multidimensional, multi-relational. There are many different ways in which historically states have tried to build their legitimacy. And for example, clientelism and patronage is one of the key ways it has happened. It's segmented and biased, but that's one key way of building legitimacy. Rachel was mentioning others. I think the issue here, though, is that from the international development community's perspective, a focus on service delivery, which is quite based on output, and also on process, is what is conceived as helping to build legitimacy and social stability in these settings, and this is what we're trying to look at in a bit further detail and to sort of dig deeper to see what that looks like. And for us, we have developed a conceptual framework trying to disaggregate legitimacy in its many different dimensions and testing on the ground what it is that people care about. But again, this is a very small qualitative study, and fully agree that we can't go into all of those dimensions. But I mean, the whole reason why there's this belief that there should be a relationship between service delivery and legitimacy and state building is because if you look at what happened in the Western world, there was very much a focus on the state providing key services as a mechanism for nationalism and state building. So education, France, Germany, all of those countries, they use this very, very purposely to build a nation and to build legitimacy. So this is what we are trying to see if it plays out in the way that it's sort of theoretically suggested that it does in these much more conflictual settings. So.
Hi, my name is Diego. I work for the World Bank. I have a question for Richard and for Bob, actually. I mean, listening to those findings, how do you think like a program or projects in Afghanistan should change or adjust? And the second part of the question is, do you see any traction in government for these kind of logic? Because normally what I see in those countries is that they buy in very quickly into this more service delivery as the solution. So how do you think they would change, and how do you think government would be receptive to those? Thanks.
Well, we've just had this very discussion with the Minister of Finance, the President of Afghanistan, his other members of cabinet, and members of the international community who are financing on healthcare, right? And it was a sort of a microcosm of this discussion and covering the gambit from the purpose of providing healthcare. And just one piece of background, the international community through the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund finances over 90%, almost 100% of the basic and primary health care in the country for all the citizens, right? Now, granted, that's such a difficult situation. It's only almost $6 per capita, so it's very, very low, but that's why we still have one of the poorest countries in the world there. But we had this very discussion, and the end of the discussion was that the purpose of providing basic and primary health care is to provide basic and primary health care to the people, right? And that's where the discussion ended up. And that's where it is going forward. So that's a very short answer to what was a lengthy meeting preceded by much work on both sides.
Richard, do you want to add?
I was at the same meeting that Bob is referring to with the President, and the President was very clear by the end of the meeting that the primary purpose of the health delivery system in Afghanistan was to be effective and efficient, whatever the mode of delivery. So whether it was through the state or through NGOs, he was not being ideological about it. He just wanted an improvement in its effectiveness and efficiency.
An interesting point from your presentation was the fact, the point around relational and interaction between people and service providers. And to me, this adds up with some of our own work. Sorry, Geoffroy Groslo from the IRC. Some of our own work, where even when you have very limited investment in improving services per se, just the act of engaging people, asking them what they want, what they think, and building relation with the providers, build up the confidence and the trust, and builds up relation and cooperation between them, and actually sometimes even improve service delivery outcomes, as some studies have found, like the Bjorkman-Svensson way back, but the recent one in Sierra Leone also. So to me, this seems to point to an interesting nexus with state building and local engagement, where a lot of state building has focused on top-down intervention. We see that there's a strong potential for the bottom-up aspect of state building to be effective. And I'd be interested to hear your thinking on this.